My dad's OCD almost killed us both. After Mom died, my dad developed these elaborate rituals he said would keep us safe. By high school, our entire lives revolved around his compulsions. Every morning started with checking the stove knob 17 times. The faucets had to be turned off with exactly 3 twists, or he'd panic the house would flood. "Did you see me turn it 3 times?" he'd ask desperately. "I need you to count with me." I loved him too much to refuse, even though participating made me feel like an enabler. The rituals kept expanding. "I'm sorry I'm so broken," he said once while making me check the garage door for the 10th time. I started carrying a notebook listing all his checking routines because missing one would send him into a panic attack that lasted hours. My own anxiety was getting worse from constantly managing his. Then Dad's contamination fears spiraled out of control. He started needing to sterilize everything with bleach, including things that shouldn't be bleached. One night, he was disinfecting the electrical outlets with a soaking rag. His hands were shaking from exhaustion after being up all night checking things. Water from the rag dripped into the outlet and sparked a fire that spread up the wall. The smoke alarm screamed while I grabbed the extinguisher. Dad just stood there frozen because leaving the room before finishing all the outlets would mean starting the whole ritual over. I had to drag him outside while spraying foam everywhere. Half the wall was black and charred. We could have died. Dad spent the rest of the night apologizing and sobbing uncontrollably. I started lying about performing his checking rituals when I was at school. But then I met Hazel and wanted to go to her house after school. When I told Dad, he started doing his hand-washing ritual over and over. His hands were already raw and bleeding under the water. He washed them for 2 straight hours until I agreed to stay home. The guilt of watching him torture himself was unbearable. But staying home meant I was slowly losing my own life to his illness. After the fire, Dad's contamination fears got worse. He became convinced we were both covered in invisible toxins from the smoke. He started making us both shower with diluted bleach every night. "Just a capful in the bathwater," he said at first. But it kept increasing. 2 capfuls, then 3, then straight bleach on washcloths. My skin started burning and peeling. Red welts appeared all over my arms and legs. "We have to get completely clean," Dad would say while his own skin cracked and bled. "The toxins are still there." I begged him to stop, but he'd have a complete meltdown if we skipped even one night. The bathroom reeked of chemicals. My eyes would water and burn. I started getting dizzy from the fumes. One night I refused to do the bleach bath. Dad completely broke down sobbing on the bathroom floor. "Please," he begged. "I can't lose you too. The contamination will make you sick. I can feel it crawling on my skin." He started scrubbing his arms with straight bleach right there in front of me until the skin came off in strips. I tried to grab the bottle, but he held on desperately. We fought over it and bleach splashed everywhere, including in my eyes. The pain was unbearable. I couldn't see anything and thought I was going blind. Dad drove me to the hospital in hysterics, apologizing over and over while I screamed in the back seat. The ER doctor saw our chemical burns and asked what happened. Dad tried to explain about decontamination, but the doctor's face went dark. She pulled me aside when Dad went to the bathroom to check the locks. "Is this happening regularly?" she asked. I wanted to protect him, but I was exhausted and terrified, and my eyes still burned. I nodded. She called social services right there. I sobbed myself to sleep that night in the hospital. I loved my dad more than anything, but his illness was destroying our bodies. My grades were failing from missing school. Hazel had stopped texting because I never had time to see her. I thought about how Dad used to be before the OCD took over, how he'd coach my little league team and make pancakes on Sundays without washing his hands between every ingredient. That person was still in there. The next morning, a social worker came to evaluate us. Dad was doing his checking ritual with the hospital room door locks when she arrived. She watched him check them 23 times before gently asking him to sit down. "Your son has chemical burns," she said quietly, "and so do you. This can't continue." Dad's face crumpled. "I'm trying to keep him safe," he whispered. "I know it seems crazy, but I can't stop. If I don't do the rituals, something terrible will happen." And that's when I broke. I looked at the social worker and said, "I can't live with him anymore when he's like this." "You don't understand what you're doing," he said to me. His hands were shaking, and I could see him fighting the urge to check the locks again. "You're going to get sick and die, and it'll be my fault." He was crying and rocking back and forth. The social worker pulled out a clipboard and started explaining what would happen next. Dad would go upstairs to the psychiatric unit for evaluation. I'd stay with a temporary foster family until they figured out if it was safe for us to live together again. Dad reached for my hand across the hospital bed, but I pulled away. I was so angry and scared and guilty all mixed together that I couldn't stand to touch him. He made this choking sound and turned his face into the pillow. The social worker kept talking about safety plans and court dates, but I stopped listening. They came to move Dad about an hour later. 2 nurses walked him toward the elevator while he kept looking back at me with this broken expression. I watched the elevator doors close on his face. A different social worker named Yemi took me to her office on the 3rd floor. She had kind eyes and spoke softly while asking me questions about our home life. I told her everything. The fire from Dad cleaning the outlets, the checking rituals that took hours, the bleach baths that burned our skin, how his hands bled from washing them so much. She wrote it all down in a notebook with this sad, understanding look that somehow made me feel worse, like she pitied us, like we were one of those terrible cases she'd tell other social workers about later. Yemi drove me across town to a foster home in a quiet neighborhood with neat lawns and normal-looking houses. A couple in their 50s answered the door. They were nice enough, telling me they had an extra bedroom and I'd be safe here. The woman showed me a small room with plain white walls and a bed with blue sheets. I put my backpack down and sat on the edge of the bed. Nothing felt safe anymore. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling and wondering if Dad was doing his checking rituals in the psychiatric unit. Were they stopping him? Was that making his panic worse? I imagined him trying to check the door locks and nurses telling him no. The thought of his anxiety spiking with no way to do his rituals made my chest hurt. I still loved him even though I was so angry I could barely breathe. The next morning, Yemi picked me up and drove me back to our house to pack clothes and school stuff. Walking through the front door felt strange. Everything looked normal but felt wrong. The living room where Dad used to check the windows 17 times. The charred black wall from the fire still visible near the outlets. I walked down the hall to the bathroom, and the chemical smell hit me immediately. Bleach soaked into the grout and tile. I grabbed my toothbrush and got out fast. In the kitchen, I saw Dad's notebook sitting on the counter, the one where he'd written down all his checking routines in neat handwriting. I picked it up and flipped through pages of his obsessive lists. Check stove knobs 17 times. Turn faucets off with exactly 3 twists. Verify garage door is closed 10 times before bed. My own handwriting was in there too from when he'd made me help count. I dropped the notebook back on the counter and went to my room. I shoved clothes into my backpack as fast as possible, grabbed my school binders and laptop, left without looking back. 3 days later, Yemi called while I was eating cereal at the foster home's kitchen table. Dad had been officially diagnosed with severe OCD. The psychiatrist was named Dr. Layla Nolan. She'd evaluated him and said he had contamination obsessions and checking compulsions. Dr. Nolan recommended intensive treatment at a residential facility that specialized in OCD, but there was a 2-week waiting list for a bed. Dad would stay in the hospital psychiatric unit until a spot opened up. Yemi asked how I was doing. I told her I was fine, even though I wasn't. After we hung up, I sat there staring at my soggy cereal. At least now it had a name. Severe OCD. Not just Dad being broken or crazy, an actual illness that maybe could be treated. Yemi set up an appointment for me with a therapist named Alma Fernandez. Her office was in a building downtown with a waiting room full of magazines and a fish tank. Alma had dark hair pulled back in a bun and wore a cardigan with pockets. She asked me how I was feeling about everything. I didn't know how to explain that I felt relieved and guilty and terrified all at the same time. Relieved that I didn't have to manage Dad's rituals anymore. Guilty that I'd told the social worker I couldn't live with him. Terrified about what would happen next. Alma nodded like she understood. She said it was normal to have complicated feelings about someone you love who's also hurt you, even if they didn't mean to. That made sense, but didn't make me feel any better. She gave me some worksheets about anxiety and scheduled another appointment for next week. My foster parents drove me to the school for the first time since the hospital incident. I'd missed almost 2 weeks of classes. Walking through the front entrance felt weird after being gone so long. Kids stared at the bandages still covering my arms from the chemical burns. Nobody asked questions, though. The school counselor pulled me aside during second period. She was a short woman with glasses who always smiled too much. She said all my teachers knew I was dealing with a family emergency. They'd work with me on late assignments. I nodded and thanked her even though catching up felt impossible. How was I supposed to care about algebra when my dad was locked in a psychiatric unit? At lunch, I sat alone in the corner of the cafeteria picking at a sandwich. Then Hazel slid into the seat across from me. She didn't say much at first, just looked at me with these worried eyes and said she'd heard something happened. I tried to hold it together but started crying right there in the middle of the cafeteria. She moved around to my side of the table and hugged me while I fell apart. I could feel other kids staring, but I didn't care. Hazel just held me and let me cry without asking questions or trying to make it better. When I finally stopped, she handed me napkins and asked if I wanted to talk about it. I shook my head. She said okay and started telling me about her weekend instead. Normal stuff about a movie she'd watched and her annoying little brother. It felt good to hear about regular life for a few minutes. Dr. Nolan called Yemi to schedule a family meeting so I could understand Dad's diagnosis and treatment plan. We met in a conference room at the hospital with a long table and uncomfortable chairs. Dr. Nolan was younger than I expected, with short blonde hair and a calm voice. She explained that Dad's OCD got much worse after Mom died because he became terrified of losing me too. The rituals were his brain's broken way of trying to prevent another tragedy. But they spiraled completely out of control until he couldn't function anymore. She used words like obsessive thoughts and compulsive behaviors and exposure therapy. I mostly understood, but it all felt overwhelming. She said Dad needed intensive treatment to learn how to manage his anxiety without doing rituals. It would be hard work and take time. There were no quick fixes. Dad joined us for the last part of the meeting. He looked exhausted and kind of foggy, like he was on medication. His hair stuck up funny and he had dark circles under his eyes. He sat down across from me and immediately started apologizing, saying he never meant to hurt me. He just wanted to keep me safe. He was so sorry about the bleach and the fire and all of it. I told him I knew that, but it didn't change what happened. The burns on my arms were still there. The fear of going back to how things were was still there. Dr. Nolan gently interrupted and said Dad needed to focus on his own recovery now, not on making me forgive him. That forgiveness would come later if it came at all. Right now, he needed to get better for himself. Dad's face crumpled, but he nodded. We sat there in awkward silence until Yemi said it was time to go. The social worker stood up and gently touched Dad's shoulder. She said they needed to move forward with the evaluation and that someone would take Dad upstairs to the psychiatric unit. Dad looked at me with these broken eyes like I'd just killed him. I wanted to take it all back, but I also knew I couldn't keep living like we had been. A nurse came in with paperwork and started asking Dad questions about his medications and medical history. His hands kept twitching toward the door locks, but he forced them down into his lap. I sat there feeling like the worst person alive while they processed him for admission. 2 days later, Yemi called to say a bed had opened up at an OCD treatment center faster than anyone expected. Dad would transfer there in a week for at least 8 weeks of intensive therapy. She explained it was called exposure and response prevention, where they make you face your fears without doing the rituals. Dr. Nolan got on the phone and warned me that Dad might actually get worse before he got better, because learning to sit with anxiety without compulsions is incredibly hard. Her voice was kind but honest. She said some patients have complete breakdowns during the first few weeks of treatment. I felt my stomach drop thinking about Dad suffering even more. Yemi picked me up from the foster home the day before Dad's transfer to let me visit him. We drove across town to the psychiatric unit in silence. I stared out the window at normal people doing normal things and felt completely disconnected from that world. The unit had locked doors and a buzzer system. We had to check in at the desk and wait in a visiting area with plastic chairs and old magazines. When they brought Dad out, he looked smaller somehow. His hair was messy and he had dark circles under his eyes, but there was also something different in his face, something that looked almost like hope. He sat down across from me at a small table and immediately started apologizing again. I told him to stop because I couldn't hear it anymore. He nodded and wiped his eyes. Then he said he was going to get better, so we could be a family again. He promised he'd do whatever the treatment required. I wanted to believe him so badly, but I was also terrified of getting my hopes up only to watch him fall apart again. The foster parents seemed nice enough, but their house felt all wrong. It smelled different, and the furniture was arranged in ways that made no sense to me. They showed me a bedroom with plain beige walls and a bed with a floral bedspread that looked like it came from a thrift store. They said I should unpack and make myself at home. Instead, I kept everything in my suitcase lined up against the wall. This wasn't home and never would be. I was just staying here temporarily until whatever happened next happened. That first night I lay in the unfamiliar bed staring at the ceiling. I got up 3 times to check if I'd turned off the bathroom faucet. The 3rd time I stood there in the dark bathroom and realized I was counting the twists. 1, 2, 3, just like Dad used to make me do. The understanding hit me like a punch to the stomach. I'd absorbed his anxiety patterns without even knowing it. His illness had gotten inside my head and changed how I thought. 2 weeks crawled by with me going to the school and coming back to the foster home and trying to pretend everything was normal. Then Yemi called and said Dad's therapist, Hugo Masterson, wanted to update her on his progress. She put the phone on speaker so I could hear. Hugo had this calm, steady voice that somehow made everything sound less scary. He said Dad was struggling with the exposure exercises. They'd been preventing him from doing his checking rituals, and he'd had a full panic attack in the hallway when they wouldn't let him go back and check the locks. Hugo said this was completely normal and expected, that Dad had to learn his fears wouldn't come true even without the rituals, but hearing that Dad was suffering made my chest feel tight and heavy. I imagined him panicking alone in that facility and felt guilty all over again for putting him there. My next session with Alma was 2 days later. I told her about the faucet checking and how I'd realized I had my own anxiety now. She nodded like she'd been expecting this. She explained that I'd been living with constant stress for so long that my body didn't know how to relax anymore. My nervous system was stuck in emergency mode. She taught me these breathing exercises where you breathe in for 4 counts and out for 6. The longer exhale is supposed to calm your body down. She said I'd developed my own anxiety issues from years of managing Dad's compulsions. I got angry hearing that. It wasn't fair that his illness had damaged me too. I knew he didn't mean for it to happen, but it still made me furious. All those years of counting with him and checking things and managing his panic had rewired my own brain. At the school the next week, Hazel found me at my locker between classes. She asked if I wanted to come over to her house after school. My first instinct was to say no and make up an excuse like I always did. But then I remembered Dad was in the treatment facility and couldn't have a meltdown about me leaving. I could actually say yes. We took the bus to her house and went down to her basement where she had this old couch and a TV. We just sat there watching movies and eating popcorn. She didn't ask about Dad or the hospital or any of it. We talked about normal stuff like the annoying substitute teacher in English and her little brother who kept stealing her phone charger. It felt like what being a teenager was supposed to be like, easy and uncomplicated and normal. For those few hours, I almost forgot about everything else. 3 weeks into Dad's treatment, Hugo called again. Yemi put him on speaker like before. He said Dad was making progress with some of the exposure exercises. He could now touch doorknobs without washing his hands immediately after. But the contamination fears were harder to treat. Dad still panicked around cleaning products and had trouble eating food he thought might be dirty. They were starting him on medication to help manage the anxiety. Hugo said it would take a few weeks to know if it was working. I felt this tiny spark of hope hearing about the progress. Maybe things could actually get better. Maybe Dad could learn to live without the rituals controlling everything. The next day, Yemi picked me up and drove me downtown to meet with a lawyer. The office was in this old building with creaky floors. The lawyer was a woman with gray hair pulled back in a bun. She explained my rights in family court in this very serious voice. If I didn't feel safe living with Dad again, I could request to stay in foster care or live with relatives. She asked if I had any family who could take me. I thought about Dad's brother Eli, who lived 3 states away. I'd only met him twice in my whole life at family reunions when I was little. He barely knew me. The idea of moving that far away and leaving Dad permanently felt like abandoning him right when he was trying so hard to get better. But I also didn't know if I could go back to living with him, even if he did improve. My grades were still a complete disaster despite all the extensions my teachers had given me. I'd missed too much school and fallen too far behind. The school counselor called me into her office and pulled up my transcript on her computer. She said I might need to repeat some classes or do summer school to catch up. Otherwise, I'd be behind for the rest of high school. I sat there staring at all the failing marks and felt this surge of anger. Dad's illness was destroying my future too. It wasn't just the chemical burns on my skin or the anxiety in my head. It was my grades and my college chances and everything I'd worked for before his OCD spiraled out of control. But I also knew he never wanted any of this. He didn't choose to get sick. 4 weeks into treatment, I finally got to visit Dad at the facility. Hugo said it had to be supervised so he'd be there watching. Yemi drove me out to the center, which was in this quiet area outside town. The building looked more like a regular office than a hospital. Inside, they had comfortable chairs and plants and windows with actual views. Hugo met us in the lobby and walked me back to a visiting room. Dad was already sitting there waiting. He looked so much better. His hands had healed because they wouldn't let him wash compulsively. The raw, bleeding skin had closed up and started to scar over. His eyes seemed clearer too, like the fog had lifted a little. We sat down at a table with Hugo in a chair nearby. Dad started telling me about the exposure exercises they made him do. How they'd have him touch things he thought were contaminated and then not let him wash his hands. How they made him leave rooms without checking the locks. He said it was the hardest thing he'd ever done. Sitting with that anxiety and not giving in to the rituals felt impossible at first, but slowly, he was learning that the terrible things he feared wouldn't actually happen. The social worker stood up and gently touched Dad's shoulder. She told him she understood he was trying to protect me, but that he needed professional help right away. Dad kept rocking and apologizing while she made phone calls to arrange his admission to the psychiatric unit. A nurse came in with medication that was supposed to calm him down. I sat in the corner watching him slowly stop shaking as the drugs kicked in. They moved him upstairs an hour later, and I didn't go with him because I couldn't look at his face anymore without feeling sick. Yemi drove me to a foster home that night, and I slept in a strange bed staring at the ceiling. The next 3 weeks blurred together with meetings and paperwork and people asking me questions about our home life. Dad stayed in the psychiatric unit until a bed opened up at the treatment facility. I didn't visit him during those weeks because Yemi said he needed to focus on stabilizing. 4 weeks after the hospital incident, I finally got to see him. Hugo met me in the lobby of the treatment center and walked me back to a visiting room where Dad was already waiting. He looked so different. His hands had healed into pink scars because they wouldn't let him wash them raw anymore. His eyes seemed clearer, like the fog had lifted. We sat down at a table with Hugo watching from a chair nearby. Dad started crying again and saying he was sorry. I'd heard him apologize 100 times before, but this time felt different. He said he was starting to understand that his rituals were hurting me instead of protecting me. The medication was helping him think more clearly, he explained. He was learning techniques to manage anxiety without needing to do compulsions. I wanted to hug him, but I was still too angry and hurt. We just sat there awkwardly until Hugo said our time was up. Walking back to the parking lot with Yemi, I felt this weird pressure building in my chest. By the time we got to her car, I couldn't breathe right. My chest got tight and I started gasping for air. I was terrified I was turning into Dad with his constant anxiety. Yemi pulled over into a parking lot and turned to face me. She talked me through breathing exercises, counting my breaths until I could breathe normally again. She said it was normal to have strong reactions after seeing him. My hands were still shaking when we got back to the foster home. The next day, I had my regular session with Alma. I told her about the panic attack, and she explained it was probably triggered by conflicting emotions about Dad. Love and anger and hope and fear all mixed together, she said. She told me I needed to work on my own recovery too, not just wait for Dad to get better. We decided I should start seeing her twice a week instead of once. That weekend, Hazel texted asking if I wanted to come to a party at her friend's house on Saturday night. I hadn't been to a party in forever. The foster parents said it was fine, so I went. Everyone was just hanging out talking about normal teenage stuff like homework and who was dating who and some new video game. I actually had fun for the first time in months, but driving home I felt guilty for enjoying myself while Dad was locked up in a treatment facility. 5 weeks into Dad's treatment, Hugo called Yemi with an update. She put him on speaker so I could hear. Dad was doing better with checking compulsions, Hugo said. He could now leave a room without going back repeatedly to check things. But his contamination fears were harder to treat. He still panicked around cleaning products. Hugo said they were working on it, but OCD recovery wasn't linear. There would be good days and bad days. A few days later, Yemi sat me down at the kitchen table in the foster home. She wanted to talk about long-term plans since Dad would be in treatment for at least 3 more weeks. She asked if I'd feel safe living with him again if he completed the program and continued outpatient therapy. I honestly didn't know how to answer. I wanted to believe he'd stay better, but I was also terrified of going back to how things were before. The foster parents seemed to sense I needed space because they invited me to their nephew's birthday party that weekend. I sat in the backyard watching all these normal families interacting. Kids were running around playing. Parents were laughing and talking without any visible anxiety or rituals. I realized I didn't even know what a healthy family looked like anymore because mine had been broken for so long. It made me sad and angry and jealous all at once. 6 weeks into treatment, I had my second visit with Dad. He seemed genuinely better this time, calmer and more present. He told me about using cognitive behavioral therapy techniques when he felt anxious. The medication was helping quiet the obsessive thoughts, he said. He didn't ask me to check anything or count with him, which felt like a miracle. Then Dad did something he hadn't done in years. He asked if I'd been doing okay in the school and with friends, actually listening to my answer instead of being trapped in his own head. We talked about Hazel and how I'd been hanging out with her more. Dad said he was glad I was having normal teenage experiences. It was the first real conversation we'd had in years that wasn't about his rituals. After the visit, Hugo pulled me aside in the hallway. He explained that Dad was making solid progress but would need ongoing support after discharge. Weekly therapy, he said. Daily medication. A structured routine to maintain his gains. Hugo asked if I'd be willing to participate in family therapy to work on our relationship and establish healthy boundaries. I told him yes, even though the idea scared me. Part of me wanted everything to go back to how it was before Mom died, but another part of me knew we needed to build something new instead of trying to recreate the past. I told Hugo I wanted to try the family therapy, but the idea scared me. Going back to living with Dad felt like stepping onto thin ice, not knowing when it might crack. Hugo leaned forward in his chair and explained that Dad's aftercare plan included safety measures to stop him from sliding backward. Regular check-ins with his therapist every week. Medication management with his psychiatrist. A crisis plan we could use if his symptoms got worse again. Hearing him list out all the support systems made my chest feel less tight. At least there would be people watching. People who could step in if things went bad. Hugo asked if I had any questions and I shook my head. I just wanted to believe this could actually work. The next day, Yemi drove me to Alma's office for our regular session. Alma had this calm way of asking questions that made it easier to talk about hard stuff. She pulled out a notebook and said we needed to identify my boundaries for living with Dad again. What did I need to feel safe? I thought about it for a minute. My own space that Dad couldn't fill with his rituals. A bedroom where he wouldn't come in to check things over and over. The ability to see Hazel and other friends without Dad panicking about contamination or needing me home. Alma wrote it all down. Then she asked the harder question. What would I do if Dad's compulsions started getting bad again? I told her I needed permission to leave without drowning in guilt. She nodded and kept writing. Seeing my requirements on paper made them feel real instead of just wishes in my head. Alma said these were healthy boundaries and we'd make sure everyone understood them before I moved back. 7 weeks after Dad entered treatment, Yemi called to say she'd scheduled a meeting at the courthouse. Dad had finished the intensive program and his treatment team said he was ready for discharge. But the family court judge needed to decide if it was safe for us to live together again. The meeting was set for the following Tuesday. I spent the weekend feeling sick to my stomach. What if the judge said no? What if she said yes, but Dad wasn't actually ready? Yemi picked me up early Tuesday morning and we drove downtown to the courthouse. Dad was already there with Hugo, sitting on a bench in the hallway. He looked nervous, but also more like himself than he had in years. His hands weren't red and cracked anymore. He smiled when he saw me, but didn't try to hug me or check anything, just said hi and asked if I was doing okay. Inside the courtroom, the judge sat behind a big wooden desk looking through papers. She was an older woman with gray hair and reading glasses. Hugo went first, standing up to testify about Dad's progress. He explained that Dad had worked hard in treatment and made real changes. The checking compulsions were way better. Dad could leave rooms without going back repeatedly. He'd learned techniques to manage his anxiety without rituals. Hugo said Dad was committed to continuing therapy and taking his medication. Then Dr. Nolan stood up. She talked about how OCD is a chronic condition that doesn't just disappear. Dad would need to manage symptoms for the rest of his life, not something that gets cured and goes away forever. But now he had tools and support systems. He knew how to handle the anxiety without letting compulsions take over. She believed Dad could live safely with me again as long as he stuck to his treatment plan. The judge looked at me and asked if I felt safe living with Dad again. My hands started shaking in my lap. I explained that I wanted to try but needed certain things in place. My own space where Dad couldn't do rituals. Freedom to see my friends without him getting anxious. A plan for what happens if his symptoms get worse. I pulled out the list Alma had helped me write and read from it because I was afraid I'd forget something important. The judge listened carefully and nodded. She said those sounded like reasonable conditions that would protect both of us. Then the judge started explaining her decision. She ordered something called a gradual reunification plan. We wouldn't just move back in together right away. First, we'd do supervised day visits where Yemi or another social worker would be nearby, then overnight stays to see how that went. Only after all that went well would we live together full time. The judge also said Dad had to keep going to therapy every week, take his medication consistently without skipping doses, allow monthly check-ins from social services for at least 6 months. If Dad violated any of those conditions, or if his symptoms got really bad again, I'd be removed from the home immediately. No second chances. Hearing her say that made me feel safer somehow. There were rules now. Protections. Dad's first day visit happened 3 days later at a park near the treatment facility. Yemi drove me there and we met Dad in the parking lot. The park had a lake with a walking path around it. Dad suggested we walk, and Yemi said that sounded good. She'd sit on a bench and give us space, but stay close enough to help if needed. Dad and I started walking slowly around the lake. He pointed out a blue heron standing in the shallow water near the shore. Then some ducks swimming with their babies following behind. It reminded me of when I was little and Dad used to take me to parks all the time, before Mom died, before the OCD took over everything. We walked in silence for a while, and it felt almost normal. Dad stopped at one point and stared at a park bench. I could see him getting tense. He said he felt anxious about contamination from the bench, worried about germs and chemicals. But then he started talking himself through it out loud, reminding himself that the anxiety would pass if he didn't give in to compulsions, that washing his hands wouldn't actually make him safer. I watched him stand there struggling with the urge to find a bathroom and scrub his hands raw. His jaw was clenched and his breathing got faster, but after a few minutes he turned away from the bench and kept walking. He didn't wash his hands. I felt proud of him even though I was also scared this progress wouldn't last. What if this was just temporary? What if he went back to how he was before? We had 3 more day visits over the next 2 weeks. Each one felt a little less weird and awkward. Dad asked about school and actually listened when I told him about my classes. He asked about Hazel and seemed genuinely happy that I was spending time with her. He apologized way less than before, which Hugo had apparently told him was better. Constant apologies just kept reminding me of all the bad stuff instead of letting us move forward. During our 4th visit, we got ice cream and sat by the lake eating it. Dad made a joke about the ducks trying to steal our food, and I actually laughed. It felt strange to laugh with him after everything that happened. 8 weeks after Dad entered treatment, Yemi told me it was time for the first overnight visit. Dad had rented a small apartment near the treatment facility so he could have a fresh start. Our old house had too many bad memories attached to it. The charred wall from the fire, the bathroom that still probably smelled like bleach. Dad said he couldn't live there anymore, and I understood. Yemi drove me to the new apartment on a Friday after school. Dad met us at the door looking nervous and excited. The apartment was small and plain, beige walls and basic furniture, clean but not obsessively sterile like our old house had become. Dad showed me the bedroom he'd set up for me. A bed with a blue comforter, a desk for homework, a small dresser, my own space like I'd asked for. It felt like maybe this could actually work. We unpacked my bag together, and Dad showed me where everything was in the apartment. The bathroom had regular soap and shampoo, nothing harsh or chemical smelling. The kitchen was stocked with basic groceries. Everything felt normal in a way our old house never did after Mom died. We ordered pizza for dinner and ate it at the small kitchen table while Dad asked about my classes and actually listened to my answers instead of being trapped in his head worrying about contamination. After dinner, we watched a movie on his laptop, sitting on the couch like regular people. But when it got close to bedtime, I could see Dad getting tense. He kept glancing toward the kitchen. His legs started bouncing up and down. I knew what was coming before it happened. Dad got up and walked to the kitchen, saying he needed to check the stove before bed. I followed him and watched as he turned the knobs to make sure they were off. Once, twice, 3 times. But then he kept going. 4, 5, 6 times. His hands were shaking and I could see the panic building in his eyes. He knew he was slipping but couldn't stop himself. 7, 8, 9 times. I stood there not knowing what to do, remembering Hugo's instructions not to participate in rituals. 10, 11, 12 times. Dad's breathing got faster and sweat appeared on his forehead. 13, 14, 15 times. Then he stopped and pressed both hands flat against the counter, his whole body trembling. He pulled out his phone with shaking fingers and called his on-call therapist. I listened as Dad explained what was happening, his voice breaking. The therapist talked him through breathing exercises and reminded him that the anxiety would pass even if he didn't finish the ritual. Dad stood there gripping the counter for almost 10 minutes while the therapist stayed on the line. Finally, his breathing slowed down and his shoulders relaxed a little. He thanked the therapist and hung up, then turned to look at me with tears in his eyes. But he left the kitchen without checking the stove again and went to his bedroom. The next morning, Dad came out of his room looking exhausted. He started apologizing right away for the checking episode, but I cut him off. I told him what mattered was that he caught himself and called his therapist instead of spiraling completely out of control. He looked relieved and said his therapist told him setbacks were normal and didn't mean he'd failed. We made breakfast together, scrambled eggs and toast, without any rituals. Dad didn't wash his hands between every step or check the stove 17 times. We just cooked and ate like normal people, and it felt like a small victory, even though I was still scared about what would happen next time he got anxious. Yemi picked me up after breakfast to take me back to the foster home. Over the next month, I did weekend visits at Dad's apartment while staying with the foster family during the week. It felt strange having two homes, packing a bag every Friday and unpacking it again on Sunday night. The foster parents' house was quiet and predictable, but never felt like mine. Dad's apartment was small and plain, but it was where I wanted to be. The separation gave me space to breathe and process everything without constantly worrying about Dad's next panic attack. Yemi said this slow approach helped both of us adjust without feeling overwhelmed. Some weekends were better than others. Dad had good days where he seemed almost like his old self, making jokes and asking about school. Other days I could see him struggling with anxiety, fighting the urge to do rituals, but he always used his techniques or called his therapist instead of giving in completely. Dad started attending an OCD support group that met twice a week at the treatment facility. He told me it helped to talk to other people who understood what it was like to have intrusive thoughts and compulsions. He seemed less alone and ashamed, more willing to talk about his illness as something he was managing instead of something he had to hide. One weekend, he told me about a woman in the group who had contamination fears so bad she couldn't leave her house for 2 years, and how hearing her story made him realize he wasn't the only person dealing with this. I was glad he was building a support network beyond just me and his therapist. For years, I'd been the only person who knew how bad things were, carrying all that weight alone. Now Dad had other people to lean on when he felt himself slipping. 10 weeks after the hospital incident, Hazel texted asking if she could meet Dad. My stomach dropped when I read the message because I was nervous about them meeting, but also wanted her to see that he was getting better. I asked Dad if he'd be okay with it, and he said yes, so we made plans to meet for coffee at a cafe near his apartment on Saturday afternoon. I was so anxious the whole morning that I could barely eat breakfast. What if Dad had a panic attack in front of her? What if he started doing rituals and she got scared? But when we got to the cafe, Dad was calm and friendly. He shook Hazel's hand and asked her questions about school and her family without any visible compulsions. We sat at a small table by the window drinking coffee and hot chocolate while they talked about normal things like movies and music. Dad didn't wash his hands or check anything or show any signs of the illness that had controlled our lives for years. After an hour, Hazel said she needed to get home, and Dad walked us outside. He told Hazel it was nice to meet her and that he was glad I had such a good friend. Later that night, Hazel texted me saying Dad seemed nice and she was glad I had him back. I read that message about 50 times, feeling this weird mix of relief and hope. Alma and I started working on my own anxiety more directly now that the crisis had calmed down. She helped me see when I was falling into worried thought patterns that I'd learned from Dad, like checking things multiple times or worrying something bad would happen if I didn't do things a certain way. She taught me breathing exercises and ways to challenge the anxious thoughts instead of believing them automatically. I was surprised by how much Dad's illness had affected my own brain. For years, I'd been so focused on managing his compulsions that I didn't notice I was developing my own anxiety problems. Alma said it made sense because I'd grown up in an environment where anxiety was constantly high, and checking things seemed like the only way to stay safe. She gave me homework assignments like leaving my bedroom without checking if I'd turned off the lights, or going to bed without checking that my alarm was set 3 times. It was harder than I expected because the anxiety felt so real and urgent. But Alma reminded me that anxiety lies, that the bad things I was worried about wouldn't actually happen just because I didn't do a ritual. 3 months after Dad entered treatment, we had our first family therapy session together. Hugo's office had 2 couches facing each other and a chair where he sat taking notes. Dad and I sat on opposite couches at first, then Dad moved to sit next to me, which felt less awkward. Hugo started by asking us to talk about what life was like before the hospital incident. I explained how I enabled Dad's rituals because I loved him and didn't know what else to do. How I'd count with him while he checked the garage door and help him make lists of his compulsions because seeing him panic was unbearable. Dad's voice shook as he admitted he relied on me to participate in his rituals because it temporarily made the anxiety quieter. He said having me there checking things with him felt like proof that the rituals were real and necessary, not just symptoms of his illness. Hugo leaned forward in his chair and explained that we'd developed an unhealthy pattern where I became responsible for managing Dad's illness instead of being allowed to just be a teenager. He said Dad had put me in an impossible position where I had to choose between enabling dangerous behaviors or watching him suffer. Dad started crying when Hugo said that, covering his face with his hands. He said he never meant to steal my childhood or make me responsible for his mental health. I started crying too because I was finally able to say out loud how exhausted and scared I'd been for years, how I couldn't sleep at night worrying about what Dad would do next, how I'd lost friends and let my grades fall because managing his compulsions took all my energy, how angry I was that his illness had damaged my life too, even though I knew he didn't mean for that to happen. It was painful, but also felt like we were finally being completely honest instead of pretending everything was fine. Hugo handed us both tissues and said this honesty was necessary for us to build a healthier relationship going forward. We spent the rest of the session talking about new boundaries we needed to set. Hugo was clear that I couldn't participate in any checking or cleaning rituals anymore, and Dad couldn't ask me to. If Dad felt the urge to do rituals, he had to use his CBT techniques or call his therapist, not involve me. Hugo explained these boundaries would protect both of us and support Dad's recovery instead of enabling his illness. Dad agreed to the boundaries, even though I could see how scared he was about managing his anxiety without my help. 4 months after the hospital incident, the judge scheduled a review hearing to check on our progress. We all went to the courthouse together, me and Dad and Yemi and Hugo. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wood paneling and fluorescent lights. The judge was a woman with gray hair and reading glasses who looked at us kindly but seriously. Hugo testified first, explaining that Dad was maintaining his progress and using his coping skills consistently. He said Dad still had bad days but was managing them appropriately with therapy and medication instead of dangerous compulsions. Yemi reported that I was adjusting well to the gradual reunification process and seemed healthier than when she first met me at the hospital. She mentioned my grades had improved with help from the school counselor and that I was seeing Alma regularly for my own therapy. The judge asked Dad directly how he was feeling and if he understood the seriousness of what had happened. Dad stood up and said he took full responsibility for hurting me, even though he never meant to. He explained that he was committed to continuing treatment and maintaining the boundaries we'd set in family therapy. Then the judge asked me if I felt safe living with Dad. My heart pounded as I stood up and said yes, that I could see he was really trying and using healthier ways to manage his anxiety. The judge nodded and said she was pleased with our progress, but would keep the case open for 6 more months with monthly check-ins to make sure we stayed on track. The judge gave us both her business card and told me to call her office directly if anything felt wrong. She scheduled our first monthly check-in for 4 weeks from now and dismissed us with a reminder that this was my last chance to have a normal family life. Walking out of the courthouse felt weird because I was happy, but also terrified that we'd mess this up. Dad's hands shook the whole drive to the foster home that Saturday morning to start packing my stuff. The foster parents had already put my clothes in garbage bags and stacked my school books in a cardboard box. They shook Dad's hand and wished us both good luck, and the foster mom hugged me and said I could call if I ever needed anything. I thanked them because they were nice people, but I felt relieved to be leaving because their house never stopped feeling temporary and wrong. Dad's apartment was across town in a building with peeling paint and a parking lot full of potholes. He carried my bags up 3 flights of stairs while I grabbed the box of books. The apartment was tiny with a living room that connected to a kitchen the size of a closet. Dad had set up the second bedroom for me with a bed and a desk and a lamp. The walls were blank, but he'd put new sheets on the bed and cleared out the closet completely. He stood in the doorway looking nervous while I put my bags down and said it was perfect. We spent the rest of the weekend figuring out where everything went and buying groceries together at the store down the street. That first week living together felt strange because we had to create completely new routines without any of his old rituals built in. Monday morning, Dad made eggs for breakfast, and I watched him turn off the stove without checking it 17 times. His hand hovered over the knob for a second, and I could see him fighting the urge, but then he just walked away and sat down to eat. Tuesday night, he had a harder time with the door locks before bed. He checked them 6 times before catching himself and stopping. He looked at me with panic in his eyes, but then took a deep breath and walked to his bedroom without spiraling into more checks. Wednesday, he acknowledged the slip and said his therapist told him that noticing the compulsion and stopping it was actually progress, even if he did it a few times first. I invited Hazel over on Thursday after school, and Dad was so nervous he cleaned the apartment twice that morning. When she arrived, he shook her hand and asked about school and her family, then told us he had errands to run and would be back in 2 hours. We hung out in my room listening to music and doing homework, and it felt amazing to have a normal afternoon with a friend in my own space. After Hazel left, Dad came back with pizza for dinner and told me he was proud that I was maintaining friendships after everything we went through. Hearing him say that made my chest feel warm because he was actually paying attention to my life instead of being trapped in his own head. The next few months went pretty smoothly with only small bumps when Dad's anxiety spiked. 5 months after he finished treatment, Dad had a really rough week where I could see him struggling more than usual. He checked the door locks 10 times on Monday night and washed his hands until they turned red on Tuesday. Wednesday morning, he called his therapist and scheduled an extra session for that afternoon. His psychiatrist adjusted his medication dosage on Thursday. I was terrified we were sliding backward into the nightmare we'd escaped from. Dad sat me down Friday night and promised he was using his support systems, and this was just part of managing a condition that would never completely go away. I had my regular appointment with Alma the next week and spent the whole session talking about how scared I was during Dad's rough patch. Alma reminded me that recovery isn't a straight line, and people with mental illness have good weeks and bad weeks. She pointed out that the big difference now was that Dad had tools and professional support and wasn't trying to white-knuckle his way through anxiety alone. She asked me what Dad did differently this time compared to before the hospital, and I realized he'd increased his therapy, called his doctor, and talked to me honestly instead of spiraling into dangerous compulsions. 2 weeks later, Dad's rough patch had stabilized and he seemed more like himself again. He thanked me for not panicking or trying to take care of him during the setback. He said that me holding our boundaries and letting him use appropriate support systems actually helped his recovery more than my old enabling behaviors ever did. I understood then that we were both learning completely new ways of being a family together. 6 months after the hospital incident, my teachers told me I'd caught up on enough work to avoid summer school. My grades were back to B's and C's instead of the failing marks I'd been getting when Dad's illness was out of control. It felt like I was finally reclaiming the parts of my life that got lost to managing his compulsions for so long. Hazel asked me to be her boyfriend officially in late spring, and I said yes without having to worry about Dad falling apart over it. We went to movies on Friday nights and hung out with her friends on weekends and did all the normal teenage stuff I'd missed out on for years. Dad met us for ice cream one Saturday and was friendly and relaxed, asking Hazel about her interests and making jokes that actually landed. After she left, he told me he was happy I had someone special in my life and he wouldn't interfere or make me feel guilty about spending time with her. Around the same time, Dad got approval from Hugo and his psychiatrist to start working part-time again. He applied at a hardware store near our apartment and got hired after being honest with the manager about his OCD and treatment history. The manager turned out to be understanding and told Dad they'd work around his therapy appointments. Dad started working 3 days a week organizing inventory and helping customers find supplies. Having structure and purpose beyond just managing his mental illness seemed to help him feel more like the person he used to be before Mom died, and everything fell apart. 7 months after Dad finished treatment, Yemi showed up at our apartment for one of her monthly check-ins. She sat at our kitchen table with her usual clipboard and asked Dad about his medication schedule and therapy appointments. Dad pulled out his pill organizer and showed her how he'd been taking everything consistently, then showed her his calendar with Hugo's weekly sessions marked in blue pen. Yemi asked me about school, and I told her my grades were mostly B's now, that I'd been hanging out with Hazel and her friends on weekends, that Alma and I were working through the guilt I still carried about everything that happened. Yemi made notes and nodded, then told us both that we were doing really well managing a difficult situation. She said Dad's commitment to treatment was obvious, and that I seemed much healthier than the scared kid she'd met in the hospital 7 months ago. Before she left, she reminded us she'd be back next month for the final check-in before the court hearing. That night, Dad asked if we could talk about something important. We sat on the couch in the living room, and he was quiet for a long time, picking at a thread on the cushion. Then he said he wanted to talk about Mom for the first time since she died. My chest got tight because we'd avoided her memory for so long, like talking about her would break something. Dad's voice shook when he admitted his OCD got so bad because he was terrified of losing me too after Mom's cancer took her so fast. He said the rituals were his broken brain's way of trying to control things that can't be controlled, trying to prevent another tragedy by checking and cleaning and decontaminating everything. I told him I missed Mom too, that I thought about her all the time, but that she wouldn't have wanted us living the way we were living. She would have been horrified seeing Dad's bleeding hands and my chemical burns and both of us trapped in his compulsions. Dad got up and went to his bedroom, then came back carrying an old shoebox I recognized from the closet. He opened it, and inside were photos of Mom from before she got sick. Pictures of her at my little league games, at the beach, making pancakes in our old kitchen. We spread them out on the coffee table and just looked at them for a while. Dad picked up one of Mom laughing at something, her head thrown back and his hands started shaking. I watched him carefully because this was exactly the kind of thing that would have triggered hours of rituals before. But Dad just sat there holding the photo, letting himself feel sad without trying to neutralize it with compulsions. His eyes got wet and he wiped them with his sleeve, but he didn't get up to wash his hands or check anything. He just stayed there with the sadness, breathing through it like Hugo taught him. We put the photos back in the box eventually, and Dad said he thought we were both healing from losing her in healthier ways now, that Mom would be proud of how hard we were working to get better. 8 months after the hospital incident, the judge called us back for the final review hearing. We sat in the same courtroom where this whole legal process started, but everything felt different now. Hugo submitted a report about Dad's consistent progress in therapy and his improved symptom management. Dad's psychiatrist sent documentation of his medication compliance and stable mental state. Yemi testified that her monthly check-ins showed sustained improvement in our home environment and that I seemed safe and well cared for. The judge read through all the paperwork, then looked at Dad and asked him directly how he was managing his OCD. Dad explained his daily routine of medication, weekly therapy, and the coping strategies he used when anxiety spiked. He admitted he still had OCD and probably always would, but that he had tools now to manage it without putting me in danger. The judge nodded and said she was pleased with our progress. She signed an order terminating the court supervision effective immediately. We wouldn't have mandatory social services check-ins anymore, though Yemi gave me her card afterward and said I could call any time if I needed help. Walking out of that courtroom felt like we were finally trusted to manage our own lives again. Dad suggested we celebrate by going to Mom's favorite restaurant, this Italian place downtown where she always ordered chicken parmesan. We got a table by the window and Dad opened the menu. Then I saw his jaw tighten when he looked at the food descriptions. I could tell he was having thoughts about contamination, about how the kitchen staff prepared things, about germs on the plates. His hand moved toward his water glass like he might start a washing ritual. But then he closed his eyes for a few seconds, doing the breathing exercises Hugo taught him, and when he opened them again, he picked up the menu and actually chose something. The food came and Dad had another moment of hesitation before eating, but he talked himself through it quietly and took a bite. We ate our meals without any rituals or panic attacks, just two people having dinner like normal families do. When the waiter brought the check, Dad raised his soda glass and said we should toast to new beginnings and second chances. I clinked my glass against his, and we both acknowledged out loud how far we'd come from that night in the hospital when everything fell apart. Life settled into a rhythm over the next few weeks that wasn't perfect, but was so much better than before. Dad still had OCD and probably always would, but he managed it with his medication, his weekly sessions with Hugo, and the coping strategies he'd learned. Some days were harder than others, and I'd see him struggle with intrusive thoughts or the urge to check things repeatedly. But he used his tools instead of giving in to compulsions, and he had support systems now beyond just me. I still had anxiety and trust issues from everything we'd been through. Sometimes I'd wake up at night panicking that I'd smell bleach or hear Dad checking the locks obsessively. Alma helped me work through those fears in our sessions, teaching me that healing from trauma takes time and that my reactions were normal given what I'd survived. We were both doing the work to stay healthy instead of pretending everything was fixed. One afternoon, I sat at our kitchen table with college brochures spread out in front of me, something that felt impossible when I was trapped managing Dad's rituals and failing all my classes. I'd been looking at schools in different states, places with good programs for what I wanted to study. Dad came home from his shift at the hardware store and saw the brochures. He sat down across from me and started reading through them, asking questions about the programs and campuses. Then he told me I should look at schools that were right for me, even if they were far away, because he had support systems now and didn't need me to take care of him anymore. He said Hugo and his support group and his psychiatrist were all there to help him manage his OCD, and that I deserved to build my own life without worrying about him falling apart. Hearing him say that made something tight in my chest finally loosen, because I'd been so scared of leaving him alone. The next day, Hazel met me after school, and we walked to the coffee shop on Main Street together. She ordered her usual caramel drink, and I got plain coffee, and we sat at a table by the window watching people walk past outside. Hazel asked how things were going with Dad, and I told her honestly that some days were harder than others, that he still struggled with anxiety and compulsions sometimes, but that we were both doing the work to stay healthy. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, then said she was proud of how far I'd come since that day in the hospital. I squeezed back and felt grateful that she'd stuck around through all the chaos and uncertainty. That night, Dad and I ate dinner together at our small kitchen table. Just spaghetti and salad. Nothing fancy. We talked about our days like normal families do. I said, Dad told me about a customer at the hardware store who needed help finding the right supplies for a project, and I told him about a test I'd done well on in history class. There were no checking rituals, no bleach baths, no panic attacks. Dad's hands had healed, and so had mine, though we both carried scars from what happened. Thin white lines on our arms that would probably never completely fade. We weren't perfect, and we weren't cured, but we were okay, and after everything we'd been through, okay felt like enough.